This is Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Secret of Our Success: How Culture is Driving Human Evolution, Domesticating Our Species, and Making Us Smarter, by Joseph Henrich. Narrated by Jonathan Yen. Publisher's note: this audiobook has bonus material of charts, tables, and graphs, which have been included on the first audio and MP3 CD of this audiobook. Please check them out as you listen, or before or after the audiobook. If you downloaded this audiobook in a digital format, please visit Tantor.com and type "The Secret of Our Success" into the search box. Follow the link to the book's page, then click on PDF Extra 1. When prompted, enter the access code SMART to access the bonus material. Preface. We humans are not like other animals. Sure, we are obviously similar to monkeys and other apes in many ways, but we also variously play chess, read books, build missiles, enjoy spicy dishes, donate blood, cook food, obey taboos, pray to gods, and make fun of people who dress or speak differently. And though all societies make fancy technologies, follow rules, cooperate on large scales, and communicate in complex languages, different societies do all this in very different ways, and to significantly different degrees. How could evolution have produced such a creature? And how does answering this question help us understand human psychology and behavior? How can we explain both cultural diversity and human nature? My journey to addressing these questions, and writing this book, began in 1993 when I quit my engineering position at Martin Marietta near Washington, D.C., and drove to California, where I enrolled as a graduate student in UCLA's Department of Anthropology. I had two interests at the time, which I'd developed while pursuing an undergraduate degree in anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. One interest focused on understanding economic behavior and decision-making in the developing world, with the idea that new insights might help improve people's lives around the globe. In part, I was attracted to anthropology because the research involved in-depth and long-term fieldwork, which I felt had to be crucial to understanding people's decisions and behavior and the challenges they faced. This was my applied focus. Intellectually, I was also keenly interested in the evolution of human societies, particularly in the basic question of how humans went from living in relatively small-scale societies to complex nation-states over the last 10 millennia. The plan was to study with two well-known anthropologists, one a socio-cultural anthropologist and ethnographer named Alan Johnson, and the other an archaeologist named Tim Earle. After a summer of research in Peru, traveling by dugout canoe among indigenous Matsugenka communities in Amazonia, I wrote my master's thesis on the effects of market integration on farming decisions and deforestation. Things were going fine. My advisors were happy, though Tim had departed for another university, and my thesis was accepted. Nevertheless, I was dissatisfied with what anthropology had to offer for explaining why the Matsugenka were doing what they were doing. For starters, why were Matsugenka communities so different from the nearby indigenous Puro communities? And why did they seem to have subtly adaptive practices that they themselves couldn't explain? I considered bailing out of anthropology at this point and heading back to my old engineering job, which I had quite liked. However, during the previous few years, I'd gotten excited about human evolution. I had also enjoyed studying human evolution at Notre Dame, but I hadn't seen how it could help me with explaining either economic decision-making or the evolution of complex societies, so I'd thought of it more as a hobby. At the beginning of graduate school, to narrowly focus my energies on my main interests, I tried to get out of taking the required graduate course on human evolution. To do this, I had to appeal to the instructor of the graduate course in biological anthropology, Robert Boyd, and argue to him that my undergraduate work met the course requirements. I'd already successfully done this for the required sociocultural course. Rob was very friendly, looked carefully over the classes I had taken, and then denied the request. If Rob hadn't denied my request, I suspect I'd be back doing engineering right now. It turned out that the field of human evolution and biological anthropology was full of ideas one could use to explain important aspects of human behavior and decision-making. Moreover, I learned that Rob and his longtime collaborator, the ecologist Pete Richardson, had been working on ways to model culture using mathematical tools from population genetics. Their approach also allowed one to think systematically about how natural selection might have shaped human learning abilities and psychology. I didn't know any population genetics, but because I knew about state variables, differential equations, and stable equilibria, I was an aerospace engineer, I could more or less read and understand their papers. By the end of my first year, working on a side project under Rob's guidance, I'd written a MATLAB program to study the evolution of conformist transmission. You'll hear more about this in Chapter 4. Entering my third year, with a master's under my belt, I decided to go back to the drawing board, to start over, in a sense. I consciously took a reading year, though I knew it would extend my time to the Ph.D. by 1 year. You could probably get away with this only in a department of anthropology. I had no classes to take, no advisors to work for, and no one really seemed to care what I was doing. I started by going to the library to take out a stack of books. I read books on cognitive psychology, decision-making, experimental economics, biology, and evolutionary psychology. Then I moved to journal articles. I read every article ever written on an economics experiment called the ultimatum game, which I'd used during my second and third summers with the Matsugenka. I also read a lot by the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, as well as by a political scientist named Elinor Ostrom. Kahneman and Ostrom would, years later, both receive Nobel Prizes in economics. Of course, along the way, I never stopped reading anthropological ethnographies. This was my fun reading. In many ways, that year was the first year of research on this book, and by the end of it, I had developed a murky vision for what I wanted to do. The goal was to integrate insights from across the social and biological sciences to build an evolutionary approach to studying human psychology and behavior that takes seriously the cultural nature of our species. We needed to harness the full arsenal of available methods, including experiments, interviews, systematic observation, historical data, physiological measures, and rich ethnography. We had to study people, not in university laboratories, but in their communities and over their life course, from babies to the elderly. From this vantage point, disciplines like anthropology, and especially subdisciplines like economic anthropology, began to look small and insular. Of course, Boyd and Richardson, building on work by Mark Feldman and Luca Cavalli-Sforza, had already laid down some of the key theoretical foundations in their 1985 book, Culture and the Evolutionary Process. However, in the mid-1990s, there was still essentially no program of empirical research, no toolbox of methods, and no established ways of testing the theories generated by the evolutionary models. Moreover, the existing ideas about psychological processes hadn't been developed very far, or in ways that easily connected with the rising intellectual tides in cultural or evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, or even with the scientific wings of cultural anthropology. During this time, 2 new graduate students had arrived to work with Rob Boyd, Francisco Gil-White and Richard McElrath, now a director at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. A little later, Natalie Smith, now Natalie Henrich, moved over from archaeology to work with Rob on cooperation. Suddenly, I was no longer alone. I had like-minded friends and collaborators with shared interests. This was an exciting and fast-moving time, as new ideas and fresh intellectual avenues seemed to be bubbling up all over the place. It felt like someone had suddenly taken the brakes off and removed the stops. Rob and I were assembling a team of field ethnographers and economists to conduct behavioral experiments around the globe and study human sociality. This was virtually unheard of, since ethnographers do not work in teams, and they certainly don't, or didn't, use economic games. Based on my first experiments in Peru, I sent off a paper entitled, "Does Culture Matter in Economic Behavior?" to a journal I'd found in the library called the American Economic Review. As an anthropology graduate student, I had no idea this was the top journal in economics, or how skeptical economists were at that time about culture. Meanwhile, Francisco was importing methods from developmental psychology to test his ideas about folk sociology and ethnicity, reference chapter 11, among herders in Mongolia. Natalie and I invented the Common Pool Resources, CPR, game to study conservation behavior in Peru. To our dismay, we later learned that it had already been invented. Richard was writing computer programs to infer cultural phylogenies, something no one had done, and was discussing with a Caltech economist named Colin Kammerer how to use computer-based experimental techniques to test theories of social learning. Francisco and I came up with a new theory of human status over coffee one morning, reference chapter 8, and inspired by reading the diffusion of innovations literature in sociology, I started wondering if it was possible to detect a signature of cultural learning from data on the diffusion of new ideas and technologies over time. Several of these early efforts later became substantial research endeavors in various disciplines. It has now been 20 years since this began for me in 1995, so I'm laying down this book as a waymark, a work in progress. I'm more convinced than ever that to understand our species and to build a science of human behavior and psychology, we need to begin with an evolutionary theory of human nature. Getting this at least partially right is paramount to taking the next step. Recently, I've been particularly encouraged by this year's World Development Report 2015, which is entitled Mind, Society, and Behavior. This World Bank document emphasizes how critical it is to recognize that people are automatic cultural learners, that we follow social norms, and that the cultural worlds we grow up in influence what we attend to, perceive, process, and value. This is a long way from my old paper's simple query, does culture matter in economic behavior? The economists at the World Bank are apparently now convinced that it does. Joseph Henrich, 22 January 2015, Vancouver, Canada.